Welcome back. This is a continuation of the cardiovascular system. We are discussing the heart. This is for chapter 18 and the second series of slides, so part B. So we're in the electrical events of the heart. And how does the heart move? Well, heart has its own set of um, excitatory cells that helps in its movement. The heart depolarizes and it contracts even without any nervous stimulation. You sever a heart and pretty much put it in a medium that's going to make it stay stable. It would keep on uh, it would keep on moving and pumping. Hence, there is actually because of its ability of this particular property, a heart can actually stay in a what do you call this in a state where it is possible for a severed heart to be what do you call this transplanted into another body. Now, although the rhythm of the heart is actually um, affected by the central nervous system, the heart itself is capable of moving by itself. So it's only the rhythm, meaning its pace can be altered by the central nervous system. So the coordinated heartbeat is a function of the presence of uh, gap junctions, and these are subcellular uh, um, subcellular proteins that help in um, enabling the heart cells to communicate with one another. So the cells form what you call an intrinsic cardiac conduction system, a network of this is actually a network of non-contractile orthorhythmic cells, and they initiate and distribute the impulses to coordinate the contraction of the heart, the depolarization and contraction of the heart. So we have a cardiac pacemaker, which is actually the one that initiates the action potential or the movement of the heart, the impulse that gets the heart to be moving. And cardiac pacemakers are cells that have unstable resting membrane potential, and we call that the pacemaker potential or pre-potential. Pretty much it has three parts in the action potential. You have what you call the pacemaker potential, where the potassium channels are closed but the sodium channels are open. It causes the interior of the cell to be more positive. Then you have the second phases, which is brought about by depolarization and repolarization. And in depolarization, the calcium channels here would open, and it makes the interior of the cell a little bit about negative 40 millivolts. It's allowing a huge influx of calcium, leading to a rising phase of action potential. And then the third is actually your repolarization. This is where your potassium takes over, the potassium channels takes over in order to some point in time bring the heart muscle cells to go back in its polarized state. It has been polarized by the opening of the gates, the ion gates. So now, instead of the um, negative charges or staying inside, and then your negative charge is getting to be lower and lower. So you're losing the resting membrane potential. So in order to repolarize the heart, make the inside more negative and the outside more positive, the potassium will have to pretty much open. The potassium channel will have to open, allowing the exit or the efflux of potassium so that the inside of the cell becomes more electric. Remember that your potassium is positively charged. So when they leave, they will carry with them their charges and will make the inside of the cell more electronegative. So the sequence of excitation in an active heart would come from that excitatory, that patch of excitatory group of excitatory cell, which you call the SA node. And pretty much this cardiac pacemaker would pass the impulses in about roughly 0.22 seconds only. So from the SA node to the AV node, then to the AV bundle, then you have the right and left bundle branches, and then you have the Purkinje fibers. And let me see, we have a good picture of that. There you go. It starts from the SA node, sending the rhythmic stimulus, and because the cells of the muscles of the heart form a network, it is, anything that is going to be sent by this pacemaker will now be sent into the network itself. So there is going to be an internodal pathway that's going to be followed by the action potential. It is now going to be received. It's now going to travel through both atria, and then it's going to be received by the AV node. AV node is resting right there at the base of the right atrium. From the AV node, the impulse is now going to be traveling into the AV bundle right there. And then from the AV bundle branches into the right and left bundle branches. And each bundle branch is now going to go and send off fibers into the subendocardial conducting network, which you call the Purkinje fibers. And this is actually going to be, the stimulus here is going to be received by the ventricular cells, and that will make the ventricles contract. Right? So, the heart is not really like a foolproof, good, is not really like doing all the time good work. There are homeostatic imbalances for some people whose heart becomes a problem. Then we'll find out what problem may cause it. Although we are not here going to discuss all of the problems of the heart, let's take a look at some which probably we may encounter in the future in some of our associates. Now, the usual homeostatic imbalance would be defects in usually in stemming from the defects in the intrinsic conduction system, and it may cause arrhythmias or irregular heart rhythms. These are uncoordinated atrial and ventricular contractions. And arrhythmias is usually brought about by some, well, one of the examples of problems that may bring about arrhythmias will be some focus or sources of stimulus other than the SA node and the AV node. If it is only the SA node and the AV node, then we know that the heart is going to be beating rhythmically according to the norms. But if there's going to be something that's causing the excitement in the heart, like an ectopic focus, then the stimulus will pretty much like cause the heart to contract at an irregular pace. Now, fibrillation is a rapid irregular contraction, and this is really quite a problem because here, when the heart is undergoing fibrillation, it is just not really acting as a pump. It is not alternating between its right side and left side to pump the oxygen poor and oxygen rich blood where they are needed. So the heart becomes useless for pumping blood. It causes the stimulation to cease and may eventually result in brain death after the heart attack. The treatment here is the use of a defibrillator. And usually defibrillation or defib interrupts the chaotic twitching, giving the heart a clean slate. It's actually what do you call this? A shock, an electrical shock, a well-contained electrical shock that's delivered right there in the chest by a machine, and it causes the heart or gives the heart a clean slate to start regular normal depolarizations. So a heart that is defibrillating will start off like this and would end up like this. It is really not doing anything, but it's just quivering. So this is a typical EKG of somebody who's undergoing ventricular fibrillation, and this one is actually ventricular tachycardia. So here's another homeostatic imbalance, one that may cause some skip beat or possibly like an irregular beat. It's an arrhythmia, and this is actually what you call ectopic focus. An ectopic focus, ectopic means outside of. And if there is the sources of this of a pumping heart is actually your AV node or your SA node, if there's something else that's causing it to uh, be excited, that's actually outside of the AV and outside of the SA. Therefore, you call that an ectopic focus. It's an abnormal pacemaker that takes over a pacing of the heart. If the AV node takes over, and let's say the AV node takes over, then it will have what you call a junctional rhythm, and it will actually be causing a rhythm of about 40 to 60 beats per minute. If the SA node is not working anymore, the AV node just takes over. That's exactly how slow our heartbeat is going to be. Now, um, an ectopic focus, like for instance this one here, you have an ectopic focus right there on the where you have a star. It can cause a, a an extra what do you call this? An extra beat right here that does not have any uh, any P wave. So you could see that the wave looks bizarre. A normal EKG would have a P and a QRS and a T uh, set of waves. But this one looks bizarre. It looks like only like you could see an R there, and um, you call this a premature ventricular contraction. This is brought about by something that is in the ventricle that is actually causing the ventricle or exciting the entire AV node to contract prematurely and in a bizarre manner. The next one is this star here, instead of in the ventricle, is you'll find is now in the AV node. When it is on the AV node, when it contracts, it is actually going to contract not in conjunction with the real SA node, but is still capable of stimulating the AV right here. Therefore, you are going to be resulting in, the same very nice QRST, um, but take note that it does not follow the rhythm of the heart, the spacing of the heart, the normal spacing of the heart. Here, this is actually premature, and it is. You could see that the P wave, that P wave right there, doesn't look like the regular P wave that you expect, which is dome shaped. This one is very small, and it is inverted, and it is coming from an excitatory group of cells that is actually not the SA node. So here we have a second degree heart block. And the second degree heart block usually would pretty much like reach the ventricle. It passes right through the AV node. That's actually the normal thing. But if the AV node here, if this is defective here, and the AV node is not going to anymore send off a signal going to the ventricle, and this is actually causing what you call a block, a heart block. And there are a few types of heart blocks. You have a type 1 heart block, or you can have a type 2 heart block. Whichever case, this heart block usually is a type of blockade that would prevent the pathway of the AV, the atrioventricular node, into sending its impulses into the ventricles. Therefore, something goes wrong that that ventricles are not going to contract. And you could see it. There is actually a skip beat here. This skip beat is brought about by that block. So we are taking a look at both the SA node and the AV node being the source of impulse of a moving heart. But is that the only reason why the heart would be moving in the way that it's supposed to? Well, that's the it's autorhythmic pacemakers are the ones that are actually primarily causing it. But there are some extrinsic innervations as well that would affect the basic rhythm of the heart. The heartbeat is modified by the autonomic nervous system via the cardiac centers that's coming all the way from the brainstem in the medulla oblongata. The cardio-acceleratory center of the medulla oblongata would send signals through the sympathetic trunk to increase both rate and force. So here, the cardio-acceleratory center stimulates the SA node and the AV node, okay, and affects also the heart muscles and the coronary arteries. Now we have also a cardio inhibitory center, um, which would send parasympathetic signals via the vagus nerve, and the effect will be to decrease heart rate. Instead of stimulating it like the cardio acceleratory center, the inhibitory center inhibits the SA and the AV nodes via a different nerve. You call it the vagus nerve. So now we're going to get, we're now going to take a look at the EKG. EKG is also known to be an electrocardiograph. It can detect electrical currents that's generated by the heart as it is actually moving. The electrocardiogram is a recording of the electrocardiograph. And the composite of all the action potentials that are being generated by the electrical currents that's flowing through a normal heart, the composite of that is standard. It's true for everybody. It's true for all people. So the main features will be the P wave, the QRS complex, the T wave, your PR interval, your ST segment, and your QT interval. And pretty much this is exactly how it looks like. This is your P wave, which is brought about by depolarization of the atrium. Then the contraction of the ventricle is going to cause a bizarre triple wave. You have the Q wave, which is a negative deflection, the R, which is a really strong or a powerful positive deflection, and the S is another negative deflection. You call it the QRS complex. The entire QRS complex is actually brought about by the depolarization of the ventricle. And then you have a slight pause right here, and then there's going to be another peak, and this peak here is brought about by the electrical activity brought about by the ventricles moving as it is actually relaxing or repolarizing. Remember that the ions are moving inside the heart when it is depolarizing and then repolarizing and repolarizing and depolarizing. So this movement of ions are read as electrical activity by an electrocardiogram and is causing this peaks. So here you go. That's your that's your P wave, which is the atrial depolarization. It's initiated by your SA node. It causes a P wave. And it is brought about by, before it goes into a QRS, there's going to be a slight delay because the what do you call this, there is actually an X amount of time, a 0.04 second time travel of the wave coming from the atrium going into the SA node, and that's actually what the delay is all about. And of course, the SA node having a narrow neck, SA node is actually a big bundle, and all of a sudden, it delivers um, it delivers stimulus through a narrow neck, and that narrow neck causes that particular delay before it can actually be received by the entire ventricle to form the QRS complex. And that is actually QRS complex. This is ventricular depolarization, which begins at the apex, causing the QRS complex, the entire QRS complex. It is bizarre because of the position of the heart. Then you have what you call an ST segment where ventricular depolarization is complete. So it's a slight pause right here, followed by a T wave, which is the ventricular repolarization, and um, the end of the entire cycle. So after the ventricular repolarization is over, the cycle is completed. It repeats again after 22.22 milliseconds to go back into another what do you call this, P wave. So if because um, the EKG pattern of all human beings are pretty much like standard. Any changes in the patterns or timing of the EKG will actually reveal a diseased or damaged heart or problems with the heart. And there are problems that could be detected, like, for instance, an enlarged R wave may indicate enlarged ventricles, elevated or depressed ST segment will actually indicate injury to the heart muscle, possibly ischemia, things like that. Or a prolonged QT interval reveals a repolarization abnormality that increases the risk of ventricular arrhythmias. So here is your normal sinus rhythm, and you could see the normal um, uh, readings of a normal person. And this is actually standard. You have your P, Q, R, S, and then a T. This is a junctional rhythm. The SA node here is non-functional, therefore you don't see any P wave because of the non-functional SA node. And you have the AV node here that's actually failing to conduct some SA node impulses. As a result, the P waves are present and the QRS waves are very little. Okay, sometimes you have P waves that are doubling up, but you don't have any QRS, and this is actually dangerous because the ventricles contracting is actually the one pushing the bulk of the blood out of the heart. Without it, then you have a useless heart. Soon you're going to have a fibrillation here. That's a second degree heart block, and this is how a ventricular fibrillation would look like. So, in the mechanical events of the heart, uh, let's take a look at some um, vocabulary first. Words that you will hear from now on as we are discussing the uh, the physiology of the heart. Systole refers to the period by which the heart is contracting. Diastole is the period by which the heart is relaxing. And a cardiac cycle is the flow through the heart during one complete heartbeat. You have a systole and a diastole, and then it's relaxed. Another systole and diastole, and then it's relaxed. So that's actually what you call a cardiac cycle. And usually the systole and diastole are followed by ventricular systole and diastole, and the atrial systole and diastole, because it's actually a group of heart muscle. It's actually two chambers. They do contract. They do have a systole and a diastole. They are followed by a systole and a diastole of the ventricle. Okay, the cycle will be a series of pressure and blood volume changes because of uh, the pressure that is being formed whenever the heart is actually contracting. Mechanical events would follow events that we see under EKG. And there are three phases of the cardiac cycle. following the left side, starting with a total relaxation. Okay. The first is actually what's called ventricular filling. Now, imagine a heart, okay, is in its diastole or relaxed mode. The first thing that's going to happen will be for when it is relaxed, it is now going to allow blood just to flow into it. And we start with ventricular filling. Why is it that we did not really start with atrial filling? Well, because the blood is coming from the atrium and is actually automatically, because we are bipeds, automatically the blood goes down into the ventricles. The AV node is open, and for as long as the AV node stays open, the SA, rather the the atrioventricular hole is actually open, and for as long as that atrioventricular hole is open, then the blood that's gushing from the veins, the big veins, into the right and left atrium will immediately go down through that AV hole into the ventricles. Remember that the valves are not closed yet at this time. Everything is open. During ventricular filling, when the ventricles are actually relaxed and starting to fill, the pressure is low. 80% of the blood would passively flow from the atria through the open AV valves into the ventricles from the atria. And remember that your semilunar valve is closed at this time. Now, atrial depolarization would trigger the first contraction, okay, the first P wave. The atria will contract after the SA node fires. The atria will contract, pushing the remaining 20% of the blood into the ventricle. So now the blood that is actually in the atria is now going to be pushed down as the atria contracts into the ventricles. And as it is contracting, it is not going to receive any blood from the big vessels because it's actually in a squeezed mode. And when it is on a squeezed mode, it's not going to allow any blood to enter it. All right. The end diastolic volume, meaning at the end, we remember that when you say diastole, we are in the diastole of the ventricle. And when heart is in diastole, the ventricles are the ones that are in diastole. We are referring always to the diastole of the big muscles, which will be the ventricle. So when we're referring to the end diastolic volume, we have here the amount of blood or the volume of blood that reaches each ventricle at the end of its resting or its diastole. So measure that, the end diastolic volume. On an average person, that end diastolic volume would the blood inside the ventricles would probably be about 120 ml, and that's a lot. Okay, that's probably like a little bit more than one big graduated cylinder, 100 graduated cylinder. If you can imagine how much a 100 ml graduated cylinder is. So here, the polarization of now spreads to the ventricles as this thing is happening. When both atria finishes their contraction, and then they return to their diastolic, the ventricles now will start to contract. So the contraction of the atria and the ventricles are not simultaneous. The atria contracts first, causing the P wave, followed by the ventricles. After that, when the ventricles are already full of blood, then it's their turn to empty out and contract. Now, the isovolumetric contraction is a state where the atria is relaxed and the ventricles are just about beginning to contract. And there is a rising ventricular pressure that would close the AV valves. The isovolumetric contraction phase, that particular state, is only a split second period, okay, when all the ventricles are actually completely not ventricles, but all the valves are completely closed. So this is where your atria has just relaxed, but then your ventricles is starting to contract. And when it contracts, poop, it closes all of the AV nodes. But then contraction is not powerful enough to open the semilunar valves. So all the ventricles are completely closed. You call this the isovolumetric contraction. This is only a split second period. Okay, and the volume remains constant. The ventricles now will continue to contract. The ventricular pressure exceeds the pressure in the large arteries, and the SL valves or the semilunar valves are now going to be forced to open. Why would the semilunar valves be forced to open? Well, because your AV valves are now going to remain closed. Remember that the valves allow only a unidirectional flow of blood. So whenever the blood is already all in the ventricles and the ventricles contract, that would immediately close the AV valves. And then it will open the SL or the semilunar valves whenever the pressure inside the ventricle will now exceed the pressure inside the big arteries. Remember that you are opening a door. It's just like opening a door, and the door at the back of the door, which should be the big arteries, the back of the door, you have also forces that are keeping the door shut, because at the back of the door is actually blood. Your big arteries are not uh, empty; they are filled with blood, and they are creating pressure. Right? The um, the pressure inside the aorta is 80 millimeters of mercury pressure. The pressure the inside the pulmonary trunk is only 20 millimeters of mercury pressure. Therefore, and that's what you call the afterload. Therefore, the amount of strength, power that is needed to push the blood into the big arteries between the right and the left side of the heart is not even. Your left ventricle must work harder to offset the 80 millimeters of mercury pressure in the aorta, whereas your right ventricle does not need to exert a greater pressure as great as the left side, because the millimeters of pressure, or rather the pressure inside the pulmonary trunk, is much lower than the right. Now we have another one which you call the isovolumetric relaxation. Following your ventricular repolarization, meaning after your what do you call this? After pumping, after contraction, the ventricles will start to relax, and you have your end systolic volume, meaning soon as your ventricles would squeeze the blood as much as they can squeeze out of the ventricles into the big arteries, there's going to be that point where they cannot squeeze anymore. Are they able to empty all their blood inside the ventricle into the big arteries? Well, most of the time, no. Meaning there is a residual amount of blood that is left in the ventricle, no matter how hard the ventricle would squeeze. And that residual volume is what you call the end systolic volume. The amount of blood remaining inside its ventricle after they have contracted, after systole. Now, in the isovolumetric relaxation, which happens during the early diastole, again, this is a split second phase. The ventricular pressure drops during a backflow of the blood from the aorta, and here the pulmonary trunk would trigger the closing of the semilunar valves. The ventricles are completely closed. The chambers are the ventricles will completely close all chambers momentarily. So here the chambers, which means the isovolumetric contraction or relaxation phase is actually at bay right here. This is only, again, a very short phase, like your isovolumetric contraction. So uh, the closure of the aortic valve would raise the aortic pressure as the backflow of the blood rebounds and would close the valve itself. This is actually called what you call the dicrotic notch. The atria will continue to fill during ventricular systole, and while the ventricles are actually in ventricular systole, the atria is already receiving blood. It's beginning to fill. And when the atrial pressure exceeds ventricular pressure, then the AV valves will open up. The cycle now will start again from the beginning. And when, the ventricles are now relaxed, and when the ventricles are relaxed, it gets to be filled with blood again. Your heart would beat about 75 times per minute, and a cardiac cycle would last about zero 0.8 of a second. Atrial systole would last about 0.1 of a second, and ventricular systole lasts about 0.3 of a second. A quiescent period is a total heart relaxation, and is about 0.04 second. This is the in-between beats where the heart is actually relaxed and is not doing anything. And it's actually a period before another heartbeat would start. Okay. Right here, okay, is a diagram on a cardiac cycle. Now, I have a video on file which I have uploaded, which is a video on cardiac cycle. Make sure that you read in order that this would, and that video is actually going to help you. This is coming from your textbook. All right. So instead of doing this, I'm going to leave it to the video. And this one too is actually on the video. So make sure that you watch that video. I have two videos there from your textbook. They are showing, or they are explaining this cardiac cycle. So what causes heart sounds? There are two heart sounds. Lub-dub, lub-dub, lub-dub. That's exactly what you hear. And these sounds are associated with closing of heart valves. First sound is brought about by the closing of the AV valves at the beginning of the ventricular systole. And the second sound is closing of the semilunar valves at the beginning of the ventricular systole. The mitral valve closes slightly before the tricuspid, and the aortic closes slightly before the pulmonary valve. The difference here would allow a clinician to auscultate each of the valves when the stethoscope is placed in 4 different regions. Heart murmurs. I remember when I was young, my doctor said that I have heart murmur. These are abnormal heart sounds that are heard when blood hits an obstruction. They usually indicate valve problem, sometimes incompetent or insufficient valve, and they fail to close completely, allowing the backflow of blood. And therefore, it would sound like the blood would have a swooshing or leaking faucet sound. The swishing sound or the regurgitation is actually the sound brought about by blood regurgitating backwards back into the atria. Or it could be because of a valve that would be stenotic valve, and it fails to open completely, and it restricts blood flow through the valve. And this one sound would cause a high-pitched sound or a clicking as the blood is forced right through a very narrow valve, a valve that is not anymore working properly. Stenotic valve would be very common among the older people, although a lot of the heart murmur would be a problem, most especially of the younger people. They outgrow it though. Now we're going to get into cardiac output. Then again, I have a video a very good video of my favorite videographer and cartoonist on the cardiac output, on preload and afterload. And I'm hoping that you are going to view it so that in the absence of my being able to go and do things on the board, you will understand what cardiac output is all about. So, cardiac output is the amount of blood pumped out by each ventricle in 1 minute. Now, it is equal to the heart rate times the stroke volume. And your stroke volume is the volume of blood pumped out by one ventricle with each beat. All right. So, usually your maximal cardiac output is about 4 to 5 times uh, resting cardiac output in a non-athletic person, which is usually like 20 to about 25 liters per minute. And the maximal cardiac output may reach 35 liters per minute in trained athletes. A cardiac reserve is actually the difference between the resting and a maximal cardiac output. Cardiac output would change or would increase or decrease if either or both the stroke volume or the heart rate is changed. But first, let's try to figure out what they are. All right. Stroke volume. I said, what is stroke volume? Stroke volume is the amount of blood that is being pumped by the ventricles in its cycle. And heart rate is the number of times that the heart beats per minute. And cardiac output is when you multiply both of them together. Okay, so these two are affecting cardiac output. Stroke volume multiplied by heart rate is cardiac output. So both of them affects cardiac output, right? So when you have, and they are affecting cardiac output directly. It's directly proportional. So whatever affects stroke volume affects cardiac output in the same manner. If the stroke volume is increased, cardiac output is increased. If the stroke volume is decreased, then cardiac output is also decreased. Same token is with your heart rate. When your heart rate is increased, cardiac output is also increased. And when your heart rate is decreased, your cardiac output is also decreased. So these are factors that are determining cardiac output. Exercise, okay, ventricular filling, which means the amount of blood that fills the ventricle, like blood-borne hormones and substances like epinephrine, thyroxine, etc. And the CNS output when you are exercising, okay, when you're anxious, okay, or any output that would affect your blood pressure. All right. Now, exercise would increase sympathetic activity, and ventricular filling is also going to be increased when you're exercising. This will increase venous return. This will increase the end diastolic volume, and this will increase the stroke volume. And therefore, exercise would eventually increase cardiac output. Same thing is true with those chemicals, the blood-borne chemicals, epinephrine, thyroxine, excess calcium. This increases contractility. It increases also the end systolic volume, and it decreases the end systolic volume, and therefore would increase the stroke volume. And then the CNS output, the central nervous system output, which is actually in response to exercise. This would pretty much like increase sympathetic activity, okay, and would increase heart rate. It decreases parasympathetic activity and increases heart rate. So here, both of them, when they are increased, cardiac output would also be increased. So let's try to look at what regulates the stroke volume. Mathematically, okay, stroke volume is the end diastolic volume minus the end systolic volume. The end diastolic volume is the volume of blood at the end of the diastole. The end systolic volume is the volume of blood at the end of a systole. So the end diastolic volume is affected by the length of the ventricular diastole and venous pressure, which is approximately 120 ml per beat. That's the end diastolic volume. The end systolic volume is affected by the arterial blood pressure and the force of ventricular contraction, which is approximately 50 ml per beat. So the normal stroke volume is about 120. You subtract 50 ml, which is about the end systolic volume. Therefore, your average stroke volume is about 70 ml per beat. So every ventricle, okay, the ventricle receives 70 ml of blood every time it's up, and it is ejecting it. Okay, when it receives 120 ml of blood, rather, okay, it is going to eject 70 ml and would leave about 50 ml as the end systolic volume. That's exactly what is meant by this particular calculation. So this is actually affected by three main factors. The first one is what you call a preload. Preload is the degree to which cardiac muscle cells are stretched just before they contract. And changes in the preload can cause changes in the stroke volume. It will also affect the end diastolic volume. And pretty much this relationship in the preload and the stroke volume is what you call the Frank-Starling law of the heart. The cardiac muscle would exhibit a length-tension relationship. At rest, cardiac muscles are shorter than the optimal length. That leads to dramatic increase whenever it starts to contract. It increase a dramatic increase in its contractile force. So the most important factor in preload is the stretching of the cardiac muscle. In the stretching of the cardiac muscle is venous return. The amount of blood returning to the heart. Okay, a slow heartbeat and exercise would increase venous return. Increase venous return distance, and it stretches the ventricles and would increase the contraction. So let's take a look at contractility. Contractility is when the contractile strength at a given muscle length, okay, which is actually independent of the muscle stretch and the systolic volume. It is actually the strength at a given length of a muscle, okay, a heart muscle, and how it contracts. Now, increased contractility would lower the end systolic volume, and it's caused by either epinephrine, calcium influx, okay, which leads to more of the cross bridges formation. And those substances that would do this would be called positive inotropic agents. They all increase contractility. Thyroxine, glucagon, epinephrine, digitalis, high extracellular calcium. Now, decreased contractility is decreased by negative inotropic agents. And these negative inotropic agents pretty much would produce acidosis, or in cases where you have acidosis, you have excess hydrogen ion concentration, increased extracellular potassium, and calcium channel blockers. These would all be negatively inotropic. All right. Afterload. Afterload is the back pressure that is exerted by the arterial blood. And I mentioned that to you, like the amount of blood that is actually pre-existing in the aorta and in the pulmonary trunk cannot be diminished. The blood is already there. Therefore, when you're trying to open the doors through the big arteries, and these doors will be opening the aortic semilunar valve and the pulmonary semilunar valve, it will be very difficult. You would need enough pressure by the ventricles to push the blood into and open the doors into a room that is already filled with blood. Okay, That is actually what you call afterload. It is a pressure that ventricles must overcome to eject the blood that is pre-existing uh, already in the big arteries, because they are creating back pressure, right? And it's preventing and it's pushing on the SL valves. So hypertension increases afterload, resulting in increased um, and systolic volume and reduced stroke volume. That's exactly what the afterload does. So whenever your afterload is in the let's say in the aorta is actually greater than 80, that means, let's say let's say it is 90. That means your diastolic pressure is 90. The afterload is 90. That means that your arterial contraction will have to be greater than just 120 millimeters of pressure. In an afterload that is regularly like in a normal person, the afterload is usually about 80 millimeters of mercury pressure in the aorta. The amount of uh, pressure that the pumping left ventricle would need to produce will be about 120 millimeters of mercury pressure. Imagine that afterload if it becomes 90 instead of 80. Your left ventricle will have to contract a much greater force, much greater than 120 millimeters of mercury, in order to open the aortic semilunar valve. That's why the person is actually now suffering from hypertension, because the afterload is actually high. So afterloads usually uh, promotes hypertension because it increases the end systolic volume and reduces the systolic the stroke volume. So if the stroke volume decreases as a result of your decreased blood volume or weakened heart, the cardiac output may be maintained by increasing heart rate and contractility. And certain medication, which are positively chronotropic factors, would increase heart rate, and negative chronotropic factors would decrease heart rate. Okay, these are substances that would pretty much like affect the cardiac output by modulating the stroke volume. So heart rate can be regulated by other factors. Let's start with the autonomic nervous system. The autonomic nervous system regulates heart rate uh, in ways rather than just with the help of your SA node and AV node. The sympathetic nervous system can be activated by emotional or physical stressors. Therefore, your hormones, your ANS hormone, like norepinephrine, is released and binds to the beta 1 adrenergic receptor of the heart. And this causes the pacemaker to fire more rapidly, increasing heart rate. The end diastolic volume decreased because of decreased fill time. And your increased contractility, okay, pretty much in increased contractility, the end systemic volume is decreased because of increased volume of ejected blood. So because the end diastolic volume and your end systolic volume would decrease, stroke volume can remain unchanged. The parasympathetic nervous system would oppose the sympathetic effects. Acetylcholine, which is a hormone secreted by the parasympathetic nerves, would hyperpolarize the pacemaker, thus opening the potassium channels, which will slow the heart rate. But this has little or no effect on contractility. And at rest, the heart at rest would exhibit what you call a vagal tone. The parasympathetic is dominant, it has a dominant influence on the heart rate, and it decreases the rate about 25 beats per minute during rest. That's why at rest, your heart is beating, the heartbeat is actually slower because of vagal tone. Okay. When a sympathetic uh, nervous system is activated, usually the parasympathetic is inhibited. So they cannot be both acting on the heart together. Now, in the Bainbridge reflex, the atrial reflex, the sympathetic reflex is initiated by increased venous return. Hence, this results in increased atrial filling. Here, the atrial walls are stretched with increased volume. It stimulates the SA node, which increases heart rate further. It also stimulates atrial stretch receptors that would activate sympathetic reflexes. Okay, so this is just again, a repeat of what we have already discussed, the same thing. Okay, let's take a look. Let's continue on with the regulation. Now, this time, let's look at the chemical regulation of heart rate. What are the things or chemicals that can affect our heart rate? Well, any chemical that is probably like mimicking the effect of the autonomic nervous system, the sympathetic nervous system, would pretty much like increase heart rate. Epinephrine increases heart rate and contractility. Thyroxine also would increase heart rate and would enhance also the effect of norepinephrine and epinephrine. Any adrenergic, uh, any chemical that is going to mimic uh, the adrenergic effect would increase heart rate. And ions, you have your intracellular and extracellular ion concentration of calcium and potassium. Okay, these must be really maintained for normal heart function. Any imbalance would be very dangerous to your heart.